The Vanishing Hitchhiker. It was the kind of night that could swallow you whole. The darkness outside my windshield seemed absolute, as if the world beyond my car had been wiped clean, leaving only an endless void. No stars, no moon, just the feeble, flickering beams of my headlights cutting a narrow path through the inky blackness. It had been raining for hours, a slow, cold drizzle that seemed to seep into everything. The wipers groaned with each swipe, the rhythmic creak the only company I had as I drove along that desolate stretch of back road. I had stayed late at the office that evening, trying to catch up on paperwork that never seemed to end. The kind of tedious work that drains you without you noticing, leaving you hollow and weary. By the time I finally left, the entire building had felt abandoned, the parking lot a shadowy wasteland. I probably should have taken the highway home, where streetlights and the occasional car would have reassured me that I wasn't the last soul on Earth. But instead, for reasons I still can't explain, I chose the back roads. Maybe I was just eager to escape the monotony of traffic. Maybe I just wanted some peace. Or maybe the road chose me. I didn't think much about it at first. It was just a road. It curved lazily through the countryside, bordered on both sides by sprawling woods that looked like walls of solid blackness under the cloud-choked sky. The trees seemed endless, stretching on for miles, and the farther I drove, the more isolated I felt. My phone had lost its signal 20 minutes ago, leaving me with nothing but the low hum of the engine and the whisper of rain against the roof. There was something eerie about the quiet. Too quiet, like the world was holding its breath. Then I saw her. She appeared suddenly, a pale figure standing on the side of the road just beyond the next curve. My headlights washed over her, and I felt my stomach drop. A young woman drenched from head to toe, her thin dress clinging to her body like wet paper. She stood perfectly still, her head bowed slightly, dark hair plastered to her face and neck. Her bare feet were planted in the muddy gravel at the road's edge, toes sunk into the wet earth as though she had been standing there for hours. I couldn't see her face clearly, just the ghostly outline of her features in the rain-smeared glass. I slammed on the brakes without thinking. My car skidded briefly before coming to a shuddering stop several yards ahead of her. My heart was hammering in my chest, and for a moment I just sat there, gripping the steering wheel and staring at the girl in my rearview mirror. She hadn't moved. She remained where she was, a motionless silhouette against the black curtain of trees. I told myself I should keep driving. It's not safe to pick up hitchhikers, especially not at this hour. But something about her, something I couldn't name, compelled me to stay. She looked fragile, like a porcelain doll left out in the rain, and the thought of abandoning her out there in the cold gnawed at me. What if she was hurt? What if she'd been stranded? I sighed, wiping my clammy palms on my jeans, and opened the door. The rain hit me immediately, icy needles that soaked through my jacket in seconds. I jogged back toward her, each step a heavy squelch in the mud. As I got closer, I saw that she was even younger than I'd thought, no more than 20, maybe younger. Her skin was deathly pale, almost luminescent in the gloom, and when she finally lifted her head to look at me, I felt my breath catch. Her eyes were dark, impossibly dark, wide and hollow, like twin pools of ink. She didn't look angry or scared. She didn't look much of anything at all. "You okay?" I called out over the rain, my voice sounding small and uncertain in the vast emptiness. "Do you need a ride?" For a long moment, she said nothing. She just stared at me, the rain running in thin rivulets down her cheeks, though her expression remained blank. Then, finally, she nodded. Just once. I swallowed hard. "Come on then. I'll take you where you need to go." She didn't thank me. She didn't even speak. She just stepped forward, her movements eerily fluid, and slid into the passenger seat of my car. I hesitated for a moment before following her back, glancing around the road as I walked. There were no other cars, no houses, no signs of life. Just the trees in the dark, stretching forever in all directions. climbed into the driver's seat and shut the door, the thud unnaturally loud in the silence. The girl sat perfectly still beside me, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The smell of rain and something faintly metallic filled the car. She didn't look at me, just stared straight ahead, her face expressionless. Her wet hair hung limp around her shoulders, dripping onto the seat. I turned the heat up, though I wasn't sure if it would help. "Where are you headed?" I asked, forcing my voice to sound casual. "You get stranded out here?" She turned to look at me then, her head moving in slow, deliberate increments. For the first time, I could see her features more clearly. Her face was smooth and pale, almost too perfect, like a mask carved from ivory. Her lips parted slightly, and her voice, when she finally spoke, was soft and strange, like a whisper from far away. "Just take me to the bridge." I blinked. "The bridge? You mean the old county bridge up ahead?" She nodded again, her dark eyes unblinking. I felt a shiver run through me, though the car was warm now. The county bridge wasn't far, maybe 10 minutes away. I knew it well, or at least I thought I did. The bridge had been closed for years after some structural damage during a flood, though it was still a well-known local landmark. The place had its share of ghost stories. Every town has places like that. But I'd never paid much attention to them. Until now. "All right," I muttered, shifting the car into drive. "I'll get you there." As we pulled back onto the road, the rain seemed to intensify, drumming against the windshield like 1,000 tiny fists. The headlights barely penetrated the gloom, and the world beyond them felt unreal, like a stage set waiting to be torn down. The girl didn't speak again. She didn't fidget, didn't shiver. She just sat there, still and silent, her gaze fixed straight ahead. I tried not to look at her. I kept my eyes on the road, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That sense of isolation I'd felt earlier had deepened, grown heavier. It felt like the world outside had disappeared completely, leaving only this road, this car, and the two of us. Then I glanced in the rearview mirror. For just a split second, I thought I saw her face reflected there, though she was sitting beside me. But it wasn't her face. It was something else. Something darker. Something twisted. I blinked hard, gripping the wheel tighter, and when I looked again, it was gone. The girl turned her head to look at me, and I nearly jumped. "Don't stop," she said softly. I forced myself to nod, my pulse hammering. "I won't," I whispered. We drove on, the bridge drawing closer with every mile. The rain never let up. It battered the windshield like a relentless tide, each droplet dragging its nails across the glass. The wipers screeched back and forth in a hopeless struggle to clear the view, but it was as though the night itself refused to be revealed. Outside, the trees on either side of the narrow road swayed like shadowy figures, looming closer with every passing mile. I gripped the steering wheel harder than I needed to. My knuckles were white, my skin clammy. I couldn't shake the cold that had seeped into the car, as though the girl had brought the chill in with her, and it had decided to stay. My heater was running full blast, but it didn't seem to help. The air between us was thick and heavy, like a fog that hadn't fully materialized. The girl sat motionless in the passenger seat. She hadn't spoken again since she'd whispered those 4 words. "Just take me to the bridge." Her hands were still folded delicately in her lap, her hair dripping water onto the seat like a leaking faucet. The smell of dampness and something faintly metallic lingered, though I couldn't pinpoint its source. I chanced to glance at her. She was staring straight ahead, her dark eyes fixed unblinkingly on the road ahead of us. There was something unnatural about her stillness, how she didn't fidget, didn't shiver, didn't even seem to breathe. I felt as though she wasn't entirely here, like a figure caught halfway between solid and shadow. I cleared my throat, trying to steady my voice. "So, is someone meeting you at the bridge?" Silence. I swallowed hard. The sound of the rain filled the void where her voice should have been. I tried again. "You live around here?" Nothing. I turned to look at her again, only briefly, but my stomach twisted when I saw her face. It was the same pale, delicate mask I'd seen before, but there was something wrong about it now. Her skin was too smooth, too flawless, as though it had been sculpted rather than born. And her eyes, her unblinking, bottomless eyes, looked darker than before. I forced my gaze back to the road. "It's not far now," I muttered, though it felt more like I was trying to convince myself. The words fell flat in the space between us. The rain drummed harder, drowning out everything else. The further we drove, the more I felt like the road itself was shifting, lengthening, twisting, changing. My headlights seemed weaker now, their glow barely piercing the rain-soaked blackness ahead. And the trees on either side of us seemed closer than they should have been, their twisted branches reaching toward the car like skeletal hands. I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake the creeping sense of dread that crawled up my spine. This wasn't normal. None of this was normal. "Do you hear that?" Her voice cut through the air like a blade. Soft, almost melodic, but laced with something that made my blood run cold. I looked at her sharply, my breath catching in my throat. She hadn't moved. Her head was still turned toward the road, her hands unmoving, but her lips had definitely parted. "Hear what?" I asked, my voice cracking. She didn't answer. Then I heard it. At first, I thought it was just the rain, a trick of sound and the constant patter against the car. But as I listened closer, I realized there was something else underneath it. A faint, rhythmic thump that seemed to be growing louder with every passing second. It was slow and deliberate, like the beating of an enormous heart. Thump, thump, thump. It wasn't coming from the car. I turned my head sharply, my pulse roaring in my ears. The sound wasn't outside the car either. It was coming from behind us. Against every instinct screaming at me to keep my eyes on the road, I glanced into the rearview mirror. For a moment I saw nothing but darkness, the smudged back window revealing only rain-slicked blackness outside. But then I saw it. A shape, faint and distant, but unmistakable. Something was in the road behind us, half obscured by the rain and mist. At first it looked like a figure, but it was hard to tell. My headlights cast just enough of a glow for me to see its outline, a tall, twisted form that seemed to shift and sway unnaturally, as though its limbs didn't move the way they should. It was walking, slowly but surely, keeping pace with my car despite how fast I was going. I blinked, sweat beading on my forehead. When I looked again, it was closer. Thump, thump, thump. The girl turned her head slowly toward me, her neck bending at an unnatural angle. The motion was fluid, smooth in a way that made my stomach churn. "Don't look back," she whispered. I tore my eyes from the mirror, focusing on the road. My chest felt tight, my lungs struggling for air. The beating sound continued, louder now, echoing inside the car like it was coming from within the walls. "Who's back there?" I managed to choke out, my hands trembling on the wheel. She didn't answer. Instead, she smiled. It was the first time I'd seen her smile, and I wished I hadn't. Her lips curled slowly, too slowly, into a grin that spread wider and wider until it no longer looked human. Her teeth, pale and sharp, seemed to glint in the darkness. Her eyes didn't blink, didn't break their focus on me. My foot pressed harder on the gas pedal. The engine growled as we sped up, the trees outside blurring into indistinct shadows. I didn't dare look into the rearview mirror again. I didn't want to see what might be catching up to us. "You can't leave him behind," she said, her voice soft and sing-song. "Who?" I shouted, my voice cracking as panic clawed its way up my throat. "Who's back there?" The girl didn't answer. She only turned back to face the road, her grin fading as quickly as it had appeared. The bridge came into view then, a shadowed arch rising up from the gloom. It looked ancient, its stone structure slick with rain and moss. My headlights barely illuminated it, but I could see the dark, roiling water beneath the arch. "Stop," the girl said suddenly, her voice sharper now. "What?" "Stop the car," she repeated. Now. I hesitated, my mind racing. Every instinct told me to keep driving, to get away from this girl, from whatever was following us. But I couldn't move. My foot lifted from the gas pedal as though it had a mind of its own. The car began to slow. "Stop here," she said softly as we reached the middle of the bridge. The car rolled to a halt. For a moment, the world seemed to fall silent. The rain stopped beating on the roof. The engine ticked faintly as it cooled, but otherwise, there was nothing. No sound, no motion, as though the bridge existed in its own little pocket of dead space. I turned to the girl, my voice hoarse. "What do you want?" She looked at me then, her dark eyes hollow and endless. "I never made it across," she whispered. Before I could respond, the back door of the car creaked open, and something climbed inside. The rain had eased into a light drizzle by the time the bridge came into view. My fingers gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles pale, as the narrow wooden structure emerged from the darkness, like a memory dragged unwillingly from the depths of my mind. It was older than I'd remembered. Weathered boards blackened by age and water, railings warped and split like brittle bones. The place seemed to breathe, exhaling cold air that swirled through the car vents despite the heater blasting. The girl beside me hadn't moved, her gaze fixed straight ahead, as if she'd been waiting for this place her entire life, or perhaps her death. I didn't want to look at her anymore. The presence of her pale figure in my peripheral vision felt like a weight pressing down on my chest. I cleared my throat, forcing myself to speak. "This is it. The bridge." The sound of my voice broke something in the silence, like a pebble shattering the surface of still water. It felt wrong. I wanted her to acknowledge me, to say anything that made her seem human. Instead, she turned her head with unnatural slowness, and for the first time she smiled. Her smile was not comforting. Her lips curved just slightly, almost as if she were trying to mimic an expression she didn't understand. I felt my skin prickle. "You can stop here," she said softly, her voice thin and distant, like it was being carried on a faint breeze. Stop? The thought of stopping on this cursed bridge turned my stomach. Everything about it felt wrong. The bridge sagged under its own weight, the wood rotting where the dark river swirled below. It was an old river, one that carried stories no one wanted to tell. Legends said that more than a few souls had vanished into its murky depths, their bodies never found, their spirits lingering like stains on the air. I felt her eyes on me, heavy and cold. Against my better judgment, I pulled the car to a stop right in the center of the bridge. The headlights spilled out across the damp wood ahead of me, illuminating the crumbling planks. Beyond the edge of the light, the shadows seemed darker somehow, like a living thing waiting just outside my reach. The girl reached for the door handle. I heard the soft click as it opened. A chill swept through the car, freezing the sweat on the back of my neck. "Wait," I said suddenly, my voice cracking. "Where are you going?" She turned her head just slightly to look at me. The smile was gone now, replaced by an expression that was impossible to read. For a long moment she didn't answer. Then she whispered, "I never made it across." Before I could respond, she stepped out of the car. I watched her through the windshield, my heart hammering so hard it felt like it might break. She moved slowly, deliberately, her bare feet leaving wet prints on the bridge. Her white dress fluttered in the breeze as she walked toward the far end of the structure, her figure growing fainter in the mist. I don't know what made me follow her. Some primal instinct to understand, to confront what was happening. I turned off the engine and stepped out of the car, the cold air searing my lungs as I inhaled sharply. The bridge creaked beneath my weight, groaning like a thing alive. I called out to her, but my voice came out hoarse, swallowed by the stillness. "Wait! Who? What are you?" She didn't stop. She was nearly at the edge of the bridge now, her silhouette barely visible through the haze. I took a step forward, then another, my boots thudding against the soaked wood. I felt watched, eyes on me from every angle, though there was no one there. The shadows along the bridge twisted strangely, as though the light from my car couldn't touch them. When I reached the center of the bridge, the air seemed to change. It grew heavier, colder. My breath misted in front of me, curling unnaturally before vanishing. The wooden planks groaned again, louder this time. I looked down. For just a moment I saw something moving in the river below, shadows swirling and writhing beneath the surface, shapes that didn't look quite human. My stomach turned violently, and I jerked my head up, unwilling to see more. The girl had stopped. She stood at the very edge of the bridge, facing the water. Her shoulders were rigid, her hair hanging limply around her face. "Don't do it!" I shouted, though I didn't know what I was trying to stop. "Come back!" Slowly she turned, and I froze. Her face wasn't hers anymore. Her skin had darkened to a sickly gray, slick with water and mottled with bruises. Her mouth gaped open, wider than it should have been, a black void that seemed to pull at the air around it. And her eyes, her dark, hollow eyes, were fixed on me, accusing and endless. "I never made it across," she whispered again, her voice layered now, like a chorus of distant cries. The sound of it hit me like ice water, each word crawling over my skin. I stumbled back, every instinct in my body screaming at me to run. But I couldn't. My feet wouldn't move, as if the bridge itself had me in its grip. The girl stepped forward, one pale, sodden foot landing heavily on the wood. Then another. She was coming toward me, slow but deliberate, her movements jerky, unnatural, like a puppet on invisible strings. Water dripped from her dress, splattering loudly against the boards, echoing like drum beats in my ears. "Stay away from me!" I shouted, my voice raw with panic. She didn't stop. I looked behind me, toward the car, but the mist had thickened, swallowing everything in a gray blanket. My chest tightened as the air seemed to thin, the cold cutting into me like shards of glass. I turned back, and she was closer now, so close I could see the unnatural twist of her jaw, the black void inside her mouth, the way her shoulders shuddered with every step. And then I heard it, the sound of water, not from the river below, but everywhere. Around me, beneath me, inside me. A deep, relentless rush that filled my ears until I couldn't hear anything else. My vision blurred, the world tilting as I tried to move, to scream, to do anything. She stopped a foot away from me. Her face was inches from mine now, close enough that I could smell the river on her breath. Her voice, when it came again, was a whisper against my ear. "You'll never make it across either." The bridge beneath me shifted. I felt it lurch, the wood splintering under my boots. My arms flailed out instinctively as the ground fell away, as though the bridge itself had opened up to swallow me. I screamed as I tumbled backward, weightless, into the waiting dark. And then, nothing. The silence was absolute. No rain, no wind, no water, just blackness. I don't know how long I floated there in the void, my mind splintering under the pressure of nothingness. When I came to, I was lying on the damp ground at the edge of the bridge, my body slick with sweat and rain. My car sat idling on the bridge, its headlights spilling uselessly into the fog. The girl was gone. I staggered to my feet, my breath ragged. My mind screamed at me to leave, to get back in the car and never look back. But as I turned, I saw it. A single, pale handprint smeared on the rear passenger window. I stumbled into the car and slammed the door, locking it out of habit. My hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white. I couldn't bring myself to look in the rearview mirror. I knew she wasn't gone. She never made it across. And somehow, I knew that wouldn't be the last time I'd see her. I don't remember driving off the bridge. The last thing I truly recall was slamming the door and gripping the steering wheel so tightly my hands felt numb, somehow, Through the rain-soaked haze and the oppressive weight of the mist, I found myself miles away from that cursed bridge. The engine hummed like a lullaby, and the wipers groaned against the windshield, their rhythm keeping time with my thundering pulse. I didn't dare look at the rearview mirror. Not once. The night still pressed in around me, thick and suffocating, a presence all its own. Trees blurred past on either side, their twisted limbs like skeletal fingers reaching for the road. My headlights seemed weaker now, struggling against the dark, as if they too were being swallowed. The world felt thinner somehow, as though I was driving through a dream that could dissolve at any moment, leaving me stranded in the void. But even as I sped away, my gut told me the bridge was still with me. Or more precisely, she was. The cold in the car hadn't lifted. I could still feel her presence, faint but undeniable, lingering in the passenger seat like a smudge of shadow. Out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw the seatbelt buckle shifting, ever so slightly, as though someone was there just beyond my vision. My breathing quickened and I forced my eyes back to the road. "Just drive," I whispered to myself, my voice shaking. "Keep going. Don't think about it." The sound of the rain grew louder, a relentless hiss against the roof. It was almost like whispers now, thousands of voices murmuring at once. I turned the radio dial, desperate for any noise that might drown it out, but the speakers only spat bursts of static. And then it happened. Out of nowhere, the car jolted violently, the tires skidding across the slick pavement. I fought to keep control, my hands jerking the wheel as the headlights flashed over a figure standing in the middle of the road. A scream clawed its way up my throat as I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out everything else. When the car stopped, the figure was gone. I sat there, shaking, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My headlights illuminated the empty road ahead, the mist curling through the beams like ghostly tendrils. I could see nothing, no figure, no movement, just the suffocating emptiness. But I knew she had been there. I knew it. Slowly, with shaking hands, I turned to look at the passenger seat. It was empty. The faint outline of the seatbelt remained undisturbed, and yet, the air around it seemed heavier, as though something invisible sat there still, waiting. I turned back to the windshield, swallowing hard, my pulse a frantic drumbeat in my chest. "I'm losing it," I muttered, trying to steady my voice. "It's all in your head. She's not here. She's..." The words died in my throat as I heard the faint click of a door unlocking. My stomach turned to ice. I looked at the passenger door. It was still shut, but the handle... it twitched. Slowly, deliberately, as though someone was trying to open it from the outside. The hairs on my neck stood on end as I watched the handle shudder again, rattling in its socket. "Stop," I whispered, though whether I was pleading with myself or whatever was out there, I couldn't say. "Please, stop." The door handle went still. I waited, my entire body tense, feeling like a live wire about to snap. The only sound was the rain drumming on the roof and the erratic pounding of my heartbeat. I wanted to believe it was over, that the nightmare had passed. And then I heard her voice, soft, whispering, right beside me. "I told you, you'll never make it across." I didn't think. I didn't breathe. I just floored the gas pedal, the tires shrieking as they spun for traction before the car lurched forward. The engine roared and the speedometer climbed, the mist tearing apart as I plowed through it. My hands shook on the wheel, my knuckles white. I didn't dare look anywhere but straight ahead. Not at the passenger seat, not at the mirrors. I could feel her though, her presence, pressing against me, watching me. The air grew colder and colder, frosting the edges of the windshield. My breath came out in short, panicked bursts, misting in the freezing air. For a moment I thought I heard laughter, a faint, hollow sound, like it came from underwater. And then, silence. The road stretched out before me, And finally, I saw the faint glow of distant lights. Civilization. I nearly sobbed with relief, forcing the car faster, the engine whining as though in protest. The mist began to thin, and the oppressive weight of the dark began to lift. I had no idea where I was going, but as long as I could put distance between myself and that thing, I didn't care. By the time I reached the edge of a small town, the rain had stopped. The streets were empty, the houses dark, but even so, I felt safer. I parked the car at a gas station, the flickering neon lights above me a cold comfort. The engine cut off, leaving only silence in its wake. I sat there for a long time, hands trembling on my lap, staring at the empty passenger seat. It looked normal again, harmless, but I knew better. The cold lingered, and I could still hear her voice in my head. "You'll never make it across." I don't know how long I sat there. An hour? 2? Time didn't feel real anymore. It wasn't until the first pale fingers of dawn crept across the sky that I forced myself to move. I got out of the car, my legs stiff and unsteady, and stumbled into the gas station. The clerk behind the counter gave me a wary look, and it was only then I realized how I must look, soaked to the bone, pale as a corpse, eyes wide and bloodshot. I bought coffee, though I didn't drink it, just held the warm cup in my shaking hands. "Rough night?" the clerk asked, trying for humor. "Something like that," I muttered. My voice sounded hollow. I didn't go back to the car right away. I sat in one of the plastic chairs by the window, watching the first cars of the morning roll by, listening to the hum of the fluorescent lights. But eventually, I had to leave. I couldn't stay there forever. When I finally slid back into the driver's seat, I hesitated. Slowly, I turned to look at the passenger window. The handprint was still there. I stared at it, bile rising in my throat. It was faint now, like it had been left hours ago, but I knew it wasn't mine. I wiped at it with my sleeve, scrubbing hard, but it wouldn't come off. It was like the glass itself had absorbed the mark. I drove home in silence. I didn't look in the mirrors, didn't let myself think about the night before. I told myself that once I got home, I could lock the doors, crawl into bed, and forget. But it didn't end there. That night I saw her again. I'd been lying in bed, trying to convince myself to sleep, when I heard it. The faint click of a car door opening. I shot up, my heart in my throat, and ran to the window. There she was, standing at the edge of my driveway, just outside the pool of light cast by the street lamp. Her head was tilted slightly, her wet hair plastered to her face. Even from that distance, I could see her eyes, dark, empty voids staring straight at me. I slammed the curtain shut. Now, every rainy night, I see her. Sometimes in reflections, sometimes standing at the edge of my vision. She doesn't move, doesn't speak, just watches. Waiting. I know what she wants. And someday she'll take me back to that bridge, where I'll never make it across.